the convergence over travel has a mechanism of time frame, time lock, time screen. General is going to get more complicated now because we're getting the higher lines of more design line in the cosmic lines of alignment. And we have to start recognizing our time frames into correlations, setting the time replacements, how we come into that positions, more calculations, screen locations, and settings, the portal frames into foundation grounds into your cosmic wheel. Now that puts everything in location in its provision lines of cycles that regenerates core centers, soul generation lines, screen adaptation, timelines at high core sensing position. 10 lines of sequence, line conditions, settings. This process here indicate lines of 0 over 1, point graphs of 0, 1, in position over 10. Now that puts position location in magnetic fields. That's a process indicator. And that puts lines of magnetic force lines into magnetic force communication system and time setting. Cosmic alignment is to gravitational line core centers of Metatron. Sets core centers of convergence system all through calculation setting and travel. This has a direct line link, panels of operation line directing inline connection setting into time sequence. Time editing, time space, locking space, pausing space, freezing space, rewinding and fast forwarding space and travel. You guys have to start recognizing how to balance it out through time line. This helps you to identify your cosmic lines into your alignments into your CERN. 6 lines of all calculation habitation, 6 in habitation, that's 12 lines of setting. Time centers, positive and negative. So that's time, center line conditions of 12, takeaway line course centers, line conditions setting, process lines, time set sequence location of question over lines, starting in position location lines equals lines of 10. Stem process lines of 0, 1, in position lines of setting. Now that communicates the high centers and sequence location of 10 itself. But the convergence system is all travels in high core centers of 10 over 1. Now how this is set up in a cosmic alignment, your ledgers are in rotation lines, it's fortune and set lines of sequence. Your platitude location setting and travel. Process that indicates system all through flux. The operators, the units, the activators are in 5,000 line centers in sequence. That's 5 years ahead of 2,000 line settings of 24 over lines of over line over rotation lines of set line communicates position all along the high operation lines of setting. That communicates the high center positions. Humanity is in position of 4,000 line rotations times centers of 1 line cycle. That puts position lines at 5 centers of travel. Now that converts the system all through operation. So coming into the construct, the infrastructure is the modification lines to your own system, how you come in your own setting into its operation lines to its convergence. Time centers, time square. That's going to have 4 centers of sequence in platitude location setting to travel. Okay, core centers, converts settings of 3 centers measure. 4 centers of accountability and rotation. Offset lines in sequence. Ground centers of set lines of travel, directing lines of link and pattern of operation state location. Circulation rotates lines of grounds. 3 centers of scale, 3 centers of measure, 3 centers of pattern, and rotates lines of spin. Spins in one direction, spins the opposite location setting a circuit. Set core centers, directing non-line centers in sequence location inside travel, outside non-core centers in the thermal, directing core centers in position of X2000. Your X2000 your center point. The process core centers solar transitional lines. Gravitational pull, process correlation setting, earth line rotations, constellation lines, alignments over line, rotation lines of flux over screen. Operation line sequence, location of grounds, and set lines of travel. On centers, 3 centers of measure, 4 centers of scale. 4 set calculation setting and 3 lines of measure, and core centers and flux lines capacitor. 3 centers of travel, direct lines of 4, calculation screen location setting, and central communication. So now operation lines of grounds and set lines of sequence. Flicking the switch, ground centers in the cosmic line into 45 flush line of angles. Set core centers directing ground centers, solar system in directions, opposite line 1/3 over grounds. Operation line sequence into cosmic awareness, directing ground centers location to its position of its operation. Setting calculation ground centers and line core centers, directing inside line connection setting, platitude location setting earth line rotations, operation lines of clocking cosmic line into stargates. Star portal, star measure, star scale, star balance. 8 sequence, octagon, core centers, Metatron, core set calculation lines into electron ground centers, line sequence, flux over 4 centers of travel, directing ground centers, lines of sequence, platitude crop circles, 4 lines of routers, directing line in position of router phone. Core centers, finger point lines of grounds, 4 centers of travel, 5 centers of scale, 6 lines of scale, communication lines convergence. Setting operation lines of ground, set lines of travel. Constellation lines of high centers into clustrum, and direct lines of grounds in set position. Operation lines of sequence, platitude line or operation line signals. Core centers, outline scale, inside travel, point lines of settings, in line rotations. 6. Outline centers in sequence. Voids of correlation setting to travel. Directing ground centers in sequence location setting. High operation lines of travel. Pointed to line rotation line condition setting to magnetic force in location and measure and scale into battery line course centers and communication lines of Mercury. Directing ground centers. Mercury sets course centers of travel. Set course centers of Jupiter. Information lines of panels. Process line indicating high centers. 6 hours ahead of schedule. 6 hours behind schedule. 6 hours in lines of setting. 6 hours in rotation lines of surface. Sets lines of travel communication lines. Earth line rotation lines of calculated setting. Inside rotation. In spectacles in string theory and rotation lines of grounds into the central system of Skynet and location. Skynet. Now, if you look really close, you can actually see the satellite in travel. Okay? Process indication over cross line. There it is in satellite communication. There's a satellite. All right, so that indicates lines of flux over grounds, set lines of translation and position of translucent into X-ray and pattern. Sets orange sequence. Now we'll go through graph screens and adaptations of flux. Correlation lines, light metaphors, and 1/3 ground. And set lines of travel. Process indicates lines of ion line centers. And position lines of blue, which is a water sequence into water containment grounds. Set course centers in 7 line rotations into 13 waters of indicate and sending signatures for location lines into electric lights. H2O, process lines HQ. Sets travels in-line outline rotation in 9 centers of scale communication positions. Operation lines of earth tone, process lines of clocking lines of time frame, time measure, time scale. Times calculation screen location at high centers of travel. Inside line connection setting convergence, directing ground centers in sequence. All right, coordinate centers in mother load. Outside central location earth line. Set travels into ground centers. Circuitry lines over lines of setting to travel. Outside signals, voids over communication setting. 3 centers of calculations. Ground lines of sequence into platitude. Operation outside set location with setting through earth rotation. Travels in ground centers who change the opposite line direct location with satellite. Inside line course centers coming to the forestry. Course centers directing lines of green lines of settings into metric realms. Inside line conditions, inside travel. Set course centers, 7 line rotation lines, 8 lines of travel, infinity over square roots. Set course centers in position to its operation lines of setting. Set course centers line connection setting to position to its operation line course centers and convergence. Indirect lines of link and process calculations. Earth line setting. All right, so we go through the correlation lines of graph. We indicate the graph screens now into rainbow graph line course centers and position of time zone. We go through the purple zones. Inside graphs, outside travel. 4 centers of communication convergence and graph communication and setting of the calculation. Okay? Now, we spin the cycles, rotate the cycle line centers. Directing CCTV, graph communication inside travel calculations time zone. Sets convergence, directing ground centers and line connections cell levels. Red cross screens, directing security panels, fields of operation. Indirect lines of link of calculation. Ground cross lines, graph line screen into metric meters of scales over bounds. Cross line indicates and setting of flux over line centers of travel. Sets communication inside line condition setting position all vectors in light and travel. Go through lacing lines, pixelation grounds, process lines of blue indicators, 2 centers of travel, central line course centers alpha beta. Now we indicate lines of flux, the coordinates of channel lines, open lines of panel. In line circuit, outline centers, out graph, and communications outputs. Out signals in online centers of sequence lines of graph communications. Indicate ground centers of sequence, platitude locate lines of orange line signals, 1 center of dots, and 4 centers of travel. So we got 6 scales of communication. All right, so change time and centers, locking screen lines adaptation, line set position location of V course, in course centers of calculation setting. Circuit lines of grounds, docking station over 5. Purple over lines, purple over charges, purple over division, purple line connection setting, mother load over travel. Set convergence setting, travels endpoint graphs and metric scales of communication lines of graph and indications. Earth line rotations, travel line connection centers, graph communication lines of all line centers. Black over lines, directing ground centers of structure line divisions of 3 centers of scale and process lines of indication lines of 4 centers of flux. Set lines of travel. Now, as we indicate triangulation line course centers, we change the clocking lines of 4 signals, the graphs course centers of 4 lines of scale, into docking meters over travel. Now, that indicates position to 1 mother settings. Mother ship comes in. Now, she's allocate timelines of frame line settings of mass and volume of indications. Distributions over 2, over 6, over 8, and over 12 line of set lines of travel. Now, that indicates position of processing line. 4x-1000 on standby in flux. Longitude, latitude, 150,000 line scale of communication lines of taxi runway. Operates line sequence, change course of time frame, and clocking lines of screen deputation of flux. Operates lines of sequence, course centers, calculations, ground centers. Calculate laser, line condition setting, pick line formation system, center ups. 4 centers of signals, 3 centers of scale of communication. Inside line condition setting, convert the system back in traction, back in location lines, and set position operation node setting through time. Set course centers, graph screens. Back in position of void over screens, directing ground centers, graph calculation screen lines of windows of indication. Inside line connections of travel, directing ground centers operation line settings. Platitude location lines, XT48000, got an XT1000, and we got an XT40 line 1 line ground, and we got an XT line centers of sequence lines of ground communication and service. Sets time frame, time correlations. Indicate lines of window frames, time lines, time locks, time calculations, time square root, line course centers, bending space in 8-line rotation, octagon course centers, magnetic tron course centers into all course centers communication lines convergence, all through operation lines of setting. Sets convergence in box frames and travels in direct lines of link of schematics over screen. Inside line connection setting, process indicates the setting a row graph screen locates to its position to its pyramid. Inside course centers, orange line cycles, directing ground centers in position over lines of scale. Process lines of 2, process lines of 3, process lines of 4 of orbiting in travel. Inside outside line connection setting position convergence. Set travels of point line communicates laser direct centers, location setting, 4 centers. Set lines of indication mapping centers, rotation lines, X marks the spot. Operates line sequence, time measure, and time scale. Process lines of 4 to 2 lines, 1 position, 2 position, void set lines of sequence. Positive number negative line course centers and set the 6 lines of measure. Sets course centers, timelines, set lines of sequence, in patterns, and rotation lines of grounds, in simulation, and rotation lines of circuits, and location lines of setting. Inside rotation lines, time reactor, change time frame at sun line course centers, and convert the system through operation setting and travel. Done by equation. It's all done. Merging accountability line course centers has a convergence system all through channel of operation lines of screen, all through traction. Done by equation. Earth line center is now in sequence of boundary calculations of clocking and towers of communication lines of modem. So the interline centers in position of its satellite routes the routers in one line cycle. The crop circles has a 4 lines of indication setting of flux. The set position lines of travels has direct lines of line connection setting. 6 convergence system back in time, 6 convergence locations ahead of time. That indicates lines of setting to time centers of 12. That indicates position of positive line center location. So it's 12 take away line centers of 2. Sets lines of 10 over tractions, 10 over 1 line sequence, 1 delay. Directing line position of 0 correlation lines of 1 signal, processing lines of 10 over traction. Sets communication location, constellation lines, ground centers, clocking rotation center, location of positions, 4 centers of sequence, and 4 centers inside setting. Okay, it says process lines of 8 over 6 over 12, 24 line rotations, 48 line rotation line centers, 72 tractions into 144 flux location. All done by equation. Okay? All right, so that's set up in time frame. All right, so let's go back to the convergence system, what I set up in timeline. Okay? All right, so we go with the convergence lines. There's constellation lines and router, course centers, and ledgers. Clocking centers, center course centers, the CERNs. Now we point the graphs and communication lines at data ports, data stations, data ops, launch stats, launch states, process lines of taxi runway, launch pads, and rotation lines of point communication and graph of indication. Inside calculation grounds, platitude lines and circuit lines of valves, 3 centers of travel, 4 centers of scale, 4 centers, 3 centers, 6 lines of communication. Directing inside line course centers, convergent outline signals, process lines outline space, and rotation lines of ground communication and setting. Operation location line grid, process lines and position operation line save locations into high positions, and all set line communications of face recognition at time stamp and set travel. Face recognition. Done by equation. Stats proceed line, general AI space line, time lock, line course centers, direct lines of aerodynamics, line course centers, and position line space above is metric over scale. Okay, air rights come in, directing ground centers at 007. Operation line centers, ground centers of sequence, customized course centers of box frames. Triangulate course centers, cities of operation line grounds, and set lines of travel. Direction time frame, outside signals, 3 grounds of signals, 3 centers of travel and direction. Set offline center location grid, cross lines location lines, inside location setting. Set communication convergence, operation signals, Fibonacci lines, portal sequence, in screen lines adaptation of Stargate, star measure, star scale, star balance, and set course centers in graviton and metatron and set lines of sequence. Operation lines, correlation setting to travel, 3 centers. Operation line, course centers, 1/3, 1/6, 1/8, 1/12, 1/24, 1 setting, 1 travel. Operation line ground centers, high set scale, soft communication lines, convergence setting lines of towers. Operation lines of grounds, set position lines of measure. Process lines of door screen, set course of graph. Operation inside line, condition setting, doors of time frame, 3 centers of travel, 3 lines of indication setting, operation lines of powder. Overline centers, pyramid activation 4 grounds, and set lines of sequence over travel. Conducting ground centers, line course centers, convert system of flux, 3 centers of scale, 6 lines of scale, of communication lines of grounds. Set course centers, electrical line grid, all in set position operation. Power generation lines into line position locations into settings. Process lines of 2,400,000 line 8 lines of watts over screen adaptation of electrical light bulbs and travel. Conducting ground centers of sequence, platitude location setting, platitude line rotations, ground centers of power, crop circles at 4 centers of indication setting, and 4 set travels and data. Operation line centers, travels of indication setting, all through travel, and direct lines at grounds, at tunnels of defense of operation lines of time reactor. Operation line settings, operation line signal location to its position, to its thermal line grounds, course centers converting system to its thermos line course centers, and its thermal course centers barometers and temperature reading course centers at time center location system, all through calculation setting of spider up and division. Set course centers time frame, inside line condition setting, process of indication setting of face recognition. That's my equation. All right, so the face has got its own void, time spec, line centers, travel point line graph course centers, line course centers, optical line course centers of travel. Ground centers of sequence, I division comes in spectacles, and 4 centers of calculations. All through setting of phantom zone and travel. That's my equation. So we got a face representation of timeline of phantom, and we got a face representation of timeline of center. Process indicates lines of travel, indicates process line direct centers in location setting of grounds of sequence. Platitude and rotations, ground centers of 3 over travels, 4 centers of calculation. Now, we indicate clocking centers of 6, process lines of 6, 6 lines of measure, 6 lines of balance, and 6 grounds of sequence. Okay, that indicates ground centers of lines of travel. Mothership comes in, overload line course centers into mass over volume. 3 centers indicate line connections to lines of pi. That indicates lines of flush over portal sequence and time scale of communication and setting. Operation line signals, location of systems, all through operation setting to its galaxy alignment of domes of indication. That's my equation. So 4 centers of calculation setting, pyramid activation of fly, line course centers, pi generation screen lines, adaptation of travel. Sets communication high centers and positions. Point graphs, clocking centers in 1/3, 1/6, 1/8, 1 measure. Longitude and latitude of center operation line, process in position of portal communication setting, locking constellation line course centers and communication system and setting. The operation line signals, webbing over 1, webbing over 3, webbing over 6, 9, 12, and 24 line position of high centers into metric meters of yards of indication. Inside calculates and ground centers, sets position of graph lines. Now we change the course center time frame. Clocking measure and position of bedding at 4 signals, operation grounds and set lines of travel. Simulation of grounds. Set location line condition setting, operation lines of ceiling, and rotation lines of position of time reactor. Done by equation. All right, so it gets more complicated, doesn't it? As we see it, information setting. All right, so that's position of its system. And then we go through the central lines and 3 centers of travel. Now that's 3 indicate lines in the cosmic lines of your ledger. That indicates the clocking centers of screen lines adaptation 6 hours ahead or 6 hours behind. So we convert the system all through modification lines and modules. Goes to the center operation in settings, your torcal fields. Change the acceleration lines into paradoxals of Praxel. Praxel course centers, perversion location setting, travels point lines graph, line condition setting to its position lines paradigm. Polar shift, graph screens, directing lines of 0 over lines, process lines of indications, process lines of indication setting, process line course centers, Orion, course centers of travels, directing course centers in Orion's belt, constellation lines of pathogens, and that indicate lines into opposition of Mega, 21 in set lines of travel. Omega 21. All right, so we take the 121 flux, process lines of 3 over scale, set position of 3 settings, 3 scales, 3 communications, and 3 set position operations. So that's 4 bending sequence, 4 centers of measure, and 4 centers of scale. Have communication across and angles. Structure lines, rainbow and frost bridge indicate lines of grounds, and portal communicates the sequence in location grid of center calculus screen location setting in travel. Very, very profound in so many lines of profound location of sequences. So it converts a system all through travels of clocking the center set communication. Okay, clocking line and constellation in center location of your system. Your foundation lines, okay, correlates and communicates to settings, all right, to your wheel, okay, your cosmic wheel. That's connected to the ledger now. Now, the ledger comes in setting sequence, so crystalline, the core lines of communication with high centers, the time frame, comes in infinity date rotation lines of set lines of sequence that sets an operation line course centers in positional location metric meters of scales of yards of communication. Comes together in rotation, okay? Done by equation, okay? There it is, all together. All right, it's amazing how you see it through webbing system and structure lines of simulation itself. Okay, cosmic alignment is now in flux over line over grounds. Now that basically puts you in position locations you're setting to your fortunes. Now the fortune has a Stargate screen directing ground centered lines of sequence. Your platitude location is now in all lines of Metatron, directing lines in graviton. Gravicode's core centers. 10 centers of sequence, process lines of 0, 1, 0, 1 on flux, process lines of 10 measure and scale. Clock in centers, operation lines of sequence, time centers, time sequence, time calculations, times pi. Period activation of 4 centers of travel, directing line link, indicate process lines embedding over line rotation. Travels of indication setting of travel. Okay? It's all done to equation. Okay? So that's how it works in all information system and set travel communication. All right? See it in all different angles. It's absolutely amazing stuff when you see it, informations off the calculation. Okay? And it goes through a spin line. Rotates the cycles in the right directions. All right, so we got the correlation lines of grounds, typical lines of positions, all through structures. Now we convert the system lines of console. That process indicates lines of flux over buildings over indicates lines of travel. Constellation wires of signatures, blue line signals, rotate the cycles, location opposite direction, location setting. That indicates ground standard sequence into cosmic awareness. Again, platitude lines, a graph screen that lines the position of webbing over lines. Operates lines, high signals, lines travels, inline communication setting, in all set lines of communication system in travel calculation. Okay? All right, so we work with line centers. X2000 comes in red signals into position of Pluto. Crosses line signals at 3 centers of scale inside of operation. Clocking lines of channel communication. And motherships on standby, outside line, inside travel. Mass volume, longitude, latitude, streaming lines, mass communications, converted system, off the setting. Distributed centers are coming in. Longitude, latitude, in positional location of setting. Discharge. And line course says engage, information lines of grounds in sequence. Operation line high centers, we bring in green line centers, the process line course centers. XD481, X channels over screen. Now, the green line centers has a matrix line lid, a process designed to indicate the setting of the cosmos that correlates the galaxy alignment and travel communication. Now, that indicates ground centers over cross lines of 3 over lines rotations, over line signals translucent, transparent, into X-ray information lines of grids over screen line adaptation to the flux, and a high course center of the cosmos in alignment set lines of travel. Done by equation. Okay? This is all set up now. Now it's already done. You're just seeing the process, how it's done. Okay? All right, so that indicates all lines of wire signatures. That's in clocking your time frame and your cosmic line centers into your alignments and screen adaptation of travel. Okay? All set in tone. Wire signatures, line signals into green, into position lines of process indication. Okay, all right. So we go through data ports of signature lines of grounds and security lines. These are data ports into communication lines into a frame that puts docking stations and hangar stations and docking bays and forward centers as sequence location of travel. Now inside line centers in rotations, rotation 1 centers a graph communication system out through setting. Building structures of division location. Okay, so we work with the inbound to the outbound line sequence. Travels to point centers. Direction triangulation, 3 centers of calculation 4. Outline signals of 4, lines of set, lines of travel. Okay, so that's a building the structure, directing ground centers and sequence lines of pi. Okay, so that's one position. Clocking lines of 0, clocking lines of 3, clocking lines of 9, line centers of 12 into 24 lines. Travels to point lines of graph. Set sequence, question over screen, 3 centers of calculation setting, docking over pi, and travel communications. Okay, it's all set up in travel, in directions, in location settings. Author operation, and travel calculation. Okay? So it's amazing how you formulate and simulate this in an all-graph communication setting through structure of a simulation set and location. All right? Okay. Now, as we come in settings, the operation line sequence, the fortitude lines position the fortress longitude and latitude of the streaming of the bandwidth change time lines. Okay, we change the sectors, vectors, and quads now, time sequence, time scale, time balance, right? Signify rotation lines of spins inside rotation. Okay, correlates the calculation timelines. So we dock station lines of 6, process lines of 9. Set position of 6, process lines of 9 over sequence lines of travel. So there's 8 scale line rotation lines of spins. The 3 centers of calculation setting converts the system into hydroponics, 3 line rotations into 144 flux. Scales of communication settings, Orion's belt, constellation lines, Earth line rotation, inhibitors of line, flash drive, and direct lines into Saturn, and communication lines of grounds in sequence. Platitude lines, fortitude location streaming, ground centers and line position of bedding, and rotation lines of 45 line angles, and travel calculation. Okay, so that's set in signal. Process lines of 83 are lines, ground centers, 4 centers of travel. So we indicate location grid. The process indicates lines of timeline sequence. Process lines of indicates system and travels. Point lines and high centers into phase recognition. That equation. All right, so this is all set up in timeline. All right, so as we convene, we set lines of 1 router over line into spectrum, into solar graph lines, into 12 convergent system, into solar line connection setting. Convergent system, docking station lines, inhibitors over lines attachment. Set operates lines of cosmos, inside rotations. Inside line travel, outside line rotation, inside calculation. 3 centers of scale, grounds, powers, and atmospheres in sync. Okay, so you set position lines as 4 centers. Boxing frame, triangulation over 3 centers of travel and direction. Inside calculation on ground centers, location online centers, energetic dome line screens, adaptation of 12 lines of flux, indicate 0 line gravity, rotate line ground centers into 12 line position of solar systems, attached to position lines of settings, process lines of H, course centers directing ground centers, HQ, processes of QR, QRS, QF, subsystem constellation, and direct lines into cosmos over directions, ground center lines of sequence and ledger, information lines of center of operation sequence, of balanced communication of high centers of travel. Okay, so very powerful when you indicate that. How you see it in all formations and travel calculations, right? Through your solar system is now attached and tethered to magnetic force of an inner pulse to an outer pulse to attract communication as magnetic force into Mercury of design. Mercury is in rotation, travels the direct lines of grounds into 98,000 line in Earth rotation setting and sequence. Operates line signals into solar direct signals in the absolute location system. The oscillator comes in formation lines of grounds and set lines of travel. Sets convergence, directing ground centers and line connection setting. XC1000 has a cosmic wheel line, rotates the ground centers to its ledger, Ross's location setting, process location to its all line connection to its roster, information lines to its position, tidal defense, string lines directing set course centers and convergence system, and time centers of travel. Indicates ground centers, course centers into command centers, directing distribution centers, operation line centers, communication high position, flight navigation consoles, directing line ground centers, communication lines of planetary line alignments, solar line rotations, and travel communications. Done by equation. Okay, it's all done. It's all done by set position. Okay? You guys have a lot of questions to ask, but it's all set up in time frame. Okay? It's all set up. All right, so as that in sequence, now you guys are tittered and attached to 12 planetary lines of solar system magnetic force. So congratulations. You guys are nothing but batters of indications now. Okay? Positive over lines of negative. Okay? So you got a positron and a negatron. Indicate position of yin and yang. Process indicates lines of road graph screens. Process lines of flux. Process lines of occasion setting. Rotation lines. Cosmic wheel. Course centers, calculations, green lines, adaptation settings. Interior ledgers. A balanced lines of 8 and a line rotation. Done by equation. Circulation rounds. Inset lines of sequence. Inside calculation setting to its operation. Okay? Circulates and modifies ground lines of travels and direct lines of link of communication timeline. All right, center course centers, set position operation sequence. Point marks a dot, 3 centers line rotation, travels in course centers. Now we have to scale the communication grounds. The timelines, lock line, pause line, center line, course centers, stargate screens. Process lines of portal communication convergence system 9 centers. Process lines of 4,000 and position lines of 5,000. Set course centers on standby to position lines of high centers. That puts position lines of system and travel calculation system and travel in direction lines of link. Now, the communication ground centers, line course centers, Earth line rotation has a flash drive service, in line conditions of Jupiter, calculation line connection Bruder, in position lines of Mercury, infinity 8 rotation lines of travel. Now, that calculation line center location has infinity 8 rotations, in an oscillator line rotation, in spectacles line screen adaptations, into floaters of communication lines, I division, and rotation lines of grounds of sequence, in set calculation. All right, so that centers, that's triangulation lines, ground centers, 3 centers of travel, 4 centers of scale, 5 centers, windows of indication lines of grounds of sequence. Okay? Now, change the formats and direct lines of grounds and oscillation lines of pathogens, location set in cosmic universe. Okay, that's indicating lines of flux now. Now we bring the X2000s above the system. They time the scales, they time rotations, they time calculation line time frames. Mothership comes in, information lines and grounds, sets sequence lines, mother load, rotations, and ground location center. Sets operation lines, magnetic force into the 12 planetary alignments and line course centers to HQ. Course centers and position activators. Direct course centers, operatives, and units. 3 centers of measure. 007, 007, 007. Connect the 3 lines of grounds, 4 centers of measure. Power generation lines of ground lines of phase direction of time frame. Done by equation. All right, so we're all done. Okay? It's all set. Okay. There you go. All right? Circulation, rotation, lines of grounds. Okay? There you go. It's all set up. So I know you guys have a lot of questions in that position. Right? So with fortitude, location, lights, the cosmic alignment is now in set. Your fortune wheel, directing line, position, ledger is now in set lines of sequence, going fast forward in line course centers. Now that's what 3 seconds in time centers. Lock and chain. It's like to a locker in that positions, right? 3 convergence over lines, process line indications, 3 centers of scale, 3 centers of communications. Circulation grounds, set lines of travel. Okay? All right, so we circulate grounds, process lines of vacation over clock lines, inside calculation setting, portal sequence, directing ground centers, half pipe, 6 lines of scale, solar system. So we indicate the ground center sequence, platitude locations, all lines, star marks, directing ground centers of portal line, course centers, and line positions, star scales of communication, star measure, and star mapping, line position, lines of position, circulation of grounds, and all lines of setting. Convert the system and time frame and travel communications. Class of course centers of travel. Set lines, solar line rotations, travels in points and line centers of loops, of indications of time centers of time frame. Sets course centers of time centers sequence into measures of scale, a Skynet, a satellite division. All right. Cloud charge mechanisms of center lines. Your I-line clouds, E-line clouds, your positional settings, and now 3 centers of travel. Grounds are set up, position lines of high centers. Convergence system, 3 times fast forward, indirect ground centers times 2, 5,000 on, rotation lines at ground core centers, plus over angle, process lines that indicate setting, process lines that indicate number of travel, process lines direct lines center interference, and indicate lines of flux over travel communication. Okay, it's all set up in location lines of grounds. All right, it's all set up. So it sets position location of your system all through time square. Okay. All right. So we're going to get you position lines of high cosmic line, direct ground centers, and nice sequence. Plot 2 lines of 3 over scale. Now that indicates core centers of calculation setting. So it's very powerful how this is all set up in travel. Okay? All right. See you guys in 5. We'll be in the cosmic line alignment, location of the Coliseum. Level A, level D. Level A, level D. Adios.